Hello and welcome to another episode of Idioms of Normality on Future Framed TV, the collective podcast series of Traces.Dreams. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Mason, and in this episode I'm interviewing Professor Ryszard Maleszka. We talk about evolution and how normality is really ill-fitting with the theory of evolution and how we need to think about other ideas, including a very strange one known as degeneracy. The interview had some difficulty. We had some difficulty, I should say, in our visual recording of this interview. So we do apologise, but hopefully you'll enjoy the audio recording of this interview. Professor Ryszard Maleszka, welcome.
Hello, Paul. How are you?
Well, thanks. And it's lovely to have you join us today. And I still remember working in your lab and you had the same moustache back then.
Well, you're very kind, but this moustache is definitely not the same. It's actually gray, and I used to have a much darker moustache. So, but it's okay. It's still there. That's probably okay.
It's great to see it there. And before we jump in the deep end, tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about the experiences and perspectives that you bring to a discussion about normality.
Sure. So I'm geneticist by education and molecular geneticist or molecular biologist by training. And I've been doing kind of a genomics and epigenomics work for the last 20 years. And I've been in this field for many, many years. We started working in Europe, in Canada, and now for quite a long time I've been in Australia, and now currently actually I'm emeritus professor. I'm still involved with ANU, but they don't pay me, so it's a bit different ballgame. A few points that I would like to make today is more looking at the question that you're asking about what is normal from the kind of an evolutionary and biological perspective. And I think you find that actually quite relevant to what we've discussed before, and when we talked about this normal, what is normal before.
Well, let's just jump in then. With that molecular biology, evolutionary perspective, what is normal?
Well, actually, I must say, until I spoke to you a while ago, I didn't realize that the term normal actually appeared in our history reasonably recently, 1830s. So, well, and at least in this current meaning. So I think it's a very interesting question to ask at this time point in human history. I mean, what we are seeing around is definitely not normal. You already have a T-shirt saying "abnormality is my power," so maybe we should actually consider abnormality. But anyway, what we are seeing now is our world in flux. In a world that is trying to find some sort of an equilibrium that in time will become a new normal. The point is, of course, we don't know what that new normal might be. I mean, we're obviously expecting lots of changes. I mean, in a few years' time, you when you travel, you would have to actually present some sort of a document that you've been vaccinated. You might still have to wear a mask, and all sorts of things will be happening. And this is actually quite interesting because we are dealing with a situation probably occurred on this planet before, but not in the kind of a techno world that's supposed to be able to deal with this kind of problem quickly. And in fact, we are obviously seeing some progress. But we are dealing with an enemy that is basically invisible, that is tiny, and but it's equipped with enormous power that many people, I don't think, sufficiently appreciate. It has the power of millions of years of evolution. And it's prepared to deal with any counterattacks very easily. I mean, the virus can mutate, and we generate one vaccine, and obviously there is another variant, and that vaccine is not as strong as it's supposed to be. And it will go for a while. I mean, we will be living with this virus forever. There's no way that particular molecule that is probably not even alive and cannot exist on its own. And that's why it needs humans. It loves to exist inside our bodies, and it will continue. So there might be some natural resistance developing, but it will always be a problem, and we have to be ready for that. So I think that new normal will be obviously different. So in a way, I mean, it's quite obvious. The normal is not something which is fixed. It's a contextual term that will be changing from time to time. And actually, I'm now going back to my original point that I want to talk about evolutionary biological perspective on normality. It's clear that living systems cannot reach some sort of equilibrium on normality. They cannot survive if that happens. The very essence of evolution and selection is actually diversity and change. So any environmental, even minor change will have effect on a given organism, on a population or society. And that change provides the power for that organism to actually adjust, select a new responses and survive. So I don't think normal is possible at all in living system. They have to actually change, they have to evolve, and they have to adjust to any changes. And what we are seeing now is probably also a nice example. Maybe naturally we will not become 100% immune, but we are changing human society is obviously driven by technology, by social interactions, and that is changing already. We can see that. Human behavior is already a little bit different. You can see that every day when you're trying to get out in your mask or whatever. So this will continue, and that kind of a contextual effect is something that this is the way how I see normal. It's not really possible, and you can only have normal for a certain context, for a certain period of time, and that normal will be replaced obviously with another normal, and you can still call it normal, but I don't think that is probably something that many people consider as normal, as something fixed, embedded in our behavior.
So distilling just a few streams of that thought, one is that normal is not a biological phenomenon, it's more of a cultural idea, and that we became accustomed to this world that we were in, and that we created this idea called normal, but actually things change and are constantly evolving. And on a biological level, stasis is actually a bad evolutionary maneuver. It's an evolutionary dead end to start getting accustomed and too comfortable and stabilizing too much. To push this conversation forward, there's certainly the discussion about how this coronavirus has completely disrupted cultural ideas of normality, but it is certainly a natural biological progression of diseases adapting to new environments. And in this case, it's a disease that's capitalizing on human vectors. In certain populations, you see higher rates of COVID, and that's not necessarily a biological phenomenon, but it can also be a cultural phenomenon as well. Whether or not those societies are equipped for lockdowns, whether or not those societies are equipped with the technological resources to combat this disease, whether they have access to vaccines, whether they don't, etc. But also what we're seeing globally is the end of the Holocene. We're seeing this new geological epoch. Some people call it the Anthropocene, and climate change is catalyzing incredible change around the world, and that's disrupting normal yet again. But if I move away from normal for a second and just talk about the evolutionary processes of organisms on this planet, if normal doesn't help us think about evolutionary processes, what characteristics of evolution will help us to think about these biological problems?
I think the kind of a behavioral aspect here is very interesting, because on the one hand, people are obviously very evolved, very sophisticated, but we also have this enormous polymorphic features in our genome. So every DNA from any human that you take will be so different from another human. Even if you take identical twins, they never really behave the same way as you would expect them. They may look very similar, but especially if they live apart, their behavior changing dramatically. And this is what actually one of the interesting studies that's being done to understand what drives this kind of a diversity of identical twins in a way that helps to understand many aspects of human behavior. And there are large cohorts of those identical twins being studied now. So in addition to this large number of polymorphic changes in our genomes that actually are very useful from let's say, perspective of genotyping and parental identification, there are other levels of kind of a diversity and polymorphism in human genome expression. So there is an epigenetic level, and that is the kind of a changes that explain the split in behavior of identical twins. So they may have identical genomes. But that clearly tells you that the genome itself is not the ultimate driver of behavior. The behavior is affected by environment, by interactions with other people, etc., etc. So that change, those changes, that environmental inputs, change the epigenetic level of regulation. And this is driven by chemical reactions. I don't want to get into these details because that's a little bit too much. But yeah, so we actually understand quite well why those identical genomes do not provide the same behavior. If those twins will live together, probably will be behaving a little bit more similarly, but if they live apart, that is a completely different story. So what is interesting to me is actually the humans are genetically very diverse and very different, but at the same time, you see this sort of like a behavior that they became, they want to be normal in a way. I remember in the 60s, I was actually dressed in a certain way and I had a hair of a special style. That was driven by the British invasion, the British music with their style of fashion and hair and music. That was actually everybody, yeah, almost every young person at that time was following. So that was normal for everybody. If you didn't do that, you would look a little bit weird, and they would, other guys or friends would look at you, listen, you don't belong here. So I think that kind of a behavior is driven by this need to actually belong to a large group. You don't want to be actually seen as an outcast. And I think we discussed this a little bit. So this is one of the problems with normal. I mean, in this case, it's nice. I mean, you follow a certain cultural pop music or something like that, but it could become actually a bigger problem. And I think you called it at some point when we were talking that the kind of a normal could be a stick and carrot of human behavior. So here, as I said, it's nice, but in any other situation, it could actually be a problem because someone can actually, who cannot be a part of that cohort of normally behaving people, could be actually seen as an outcast, as a person who does not belong. And I think this is something that you are probably pointing out in your comment.
At an evolutionary level, we can't think of genes as just very strict prescriptions about what an organism will become throughout its life. There is a lot of environmental input. And I guess in this description that you gave us, normal is this environmental input on the organism. And in the name of normality, we are changing so many things about a very diverse array of organisms. Humans are very diverse, as you said, but there's this centripetal force that funnels everyone into a certain sense of normality. And then some people have to do more changes than others in order to conform to that centralizing magnetism of normality.
Yeah, right. So in a way, I mean, the changing environment and this COVID virus situation is a good example. I mean, it will have major impact on our behavior because some sort of normality will be enforced on us. I mean, you already see that. I mean, the governments and local authorities, they have to do something to kind of at least prevent a major spread of the virus. So that enforces certain rules and guidelines on people, and that is the kind of new normal. And you can, of course, you don't have to follow that probably, but this is probably not exactly what you are thinking about, because it's probably law and kind of regulations that we obey. I mean, we have to wear a seatbelt when you are in a car. So that became normal. I remember when those seatbelts were introduced in many countries, that people didn't like it. They didn't want to do that. It was against their freedom, etc., etc. Especially in the US, that was a big problem, and people were not wearing those seatbelts. But I guess it became normal. I mean, now you enter your car and you put the seatbelt on yourself, and you don't even think about it. It's part of your normal behavior now, and there are many other examples of like that. So this kind of a social kind of profile would have to be actually there. Otherwise, a society cannot probably function, and that would be another problem that we don't want to add to all sorts of existing problems.
So Richard, you and I have worked on a very quirky idea, which has a very strange name, and one that will that is not immediately understandable to people outside very specialized areas of science. We worked on a concept called degeneracy, and the technical description is that there are multiple structures that can perform the same function with respect to context. But what I guess a more colloquial definition would be there's more than one way to skin a cat. There's more than one way to skin a cat. There's more than one pathway to the
achieve
same
a certain goal. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Tell me more about degeneracy and its role in evolutionary processes and perhaps more widely.
Well, I guess it's a huge term in a way, so we could talk for another few hours about that. But just briefly, in biology, it has a completely different meaning than in kind of a common conversation. When you say it's degenerate, that probably means something not good, or degenerate diseases are basically diseases that destroy your body. But in biology, as you already said, we know already there are a number of ways to achieve a certain goal. And our brain is a fantastic example of that. It's actually based on the degenerate system. And brain is so complex that you cannot really kind of expect that things can be done always the same way, because neuronal wiring is virtually impossible to repeat. So for each individual, there are different wiring processes and different patterns are being established. But in a way, we are still getting similar responses, similar behaviors. And this is because certain neuronal groups can form the so-called selection groups, and then they basically then perform similar functions. So this is actually probably essence of a living system, that we are based on degeneracy. And the main reason it is actually important that humans have only about 20,000 genes, and we are so complex. And this number is actually staggering in terms when you compare the number of our genes to, let's say, simple fruit fly or a nematode. They have as many genes as humans. In fact, some of the arthropods, like Daphnia, the little crustacean that people use to feed fish, has actually more genes than humans. It has over 30,000 genes. So one would say, what's going on? How could that be possible? How a human brain and how a human complexity can be created from such a small number of genes? This is possible because our genes are directed and expressed in the kind of a degenerate way. So they can be expressed in a combinatorial way. And there are also other levels of regulation that give them the chance to select their responses and get the best output under certain conditions. So this is the beauty of biology. Instead of going in evolution for designing or inventing more and more and more genes and proteins, the evolution found a very, very nice sort of a solution to this problem. Why waste millions of years on trying to design or invent more genes, which is not that simple actually, when you can do that in a different way? Just develop a number of regulatory layers, use them in a combinatorial way, and there you go. And you have different ways you can achieve the same goal by exploring those combinatorial or, in a way, degenerate networks.
When I simplify that down to, say, the discussion of humans and the pathways in our brain, that two humans will be using different pathways to achieve the same behavior. So the funny thing here to think of, to my mind, is that two human beings might be participating in the same normal behavior, but the physiological processes and the neurological processes those two bodies are going through in order to perform the same task are completely different. And if I understand you correctly, not just two different people, but also the same person at two different points of time is recruiting two completely different neuronal pathways to achieve the same behavior. And if that's a normal behavior or an abnormal behavior, or
Yeah, that's right. So this famous neuroscientist, Gerald Edelman, actually, he created this concept of neuronal group selection. And he actually, one of the examples that he was using is a newborn child. When you look at the newborn child, it's sort of waving his hands and legs, just there's no coordination. And you see that things are sort of happening there. And eventually, if you see what happens with this child hand, at some point, it grabs, let's say, a little toy. And it takes a long time, I must say, to do that. But what happens there, this neuronal group selection that was activated during that process will become fixed in his brain. And he will be using, or she will be using that neuronal group to perform that specific task. So as they say, neurons that fire together, and those neurons during that particular process fired, they wire together. So then they are fixed. There's nothing you can do. There's nothing else you have to do. This is done. And in another child, there will be a similar problem and process in action, but another neuronal group selections will be selected. So neurons from a certain brain region, obviously, but not the same specific neurons. I mean, there's no way because of the human brain complexity. It's been actually shown that even in frogs that have much simpler brains, when they wire, the neurons wire in the brain, the wiring pattern is never the same. So even there, it's a little bit different. So, but it doesn't really matter. That's fine.
In terms of understanding an evolutionary system, it's funny that degeneracy is such an overlooked process. And partly, I think the word degeneracy is off-putting for people and they don't think it's more important to look into, perhaps. When you have a selectional system doesn't choose between something and nothing. It chooses between two things that can perform the same task in different ways, at different efficiencies, using different muscle groups, using different neuronal pathways, whichever way that is. The context is what shifts the selection of which pathway is the best way to use, physiological, neurologically, or otherwise, with respect to context. And so when I think about the current predicament for humans in the face of COVID, in the face of climate change, it seems to me that we perhaps shouldn't be looking for a new normal, but perhaps be trying to expand our repertoire of degeneracy.
Yes, well, I guess one problem with this term is that in biology, many people actually don't recognize that term per se. They always throw another term called redundant system. And in a way, this probably as a kind of your intuition, or many people's intuition will be to use that term, but that's not exactly correct because redundant systems are structurally the same units. They are not what we were just talking about. They are not different ways to get to a certain point. They are the same way to achieve the same outcome. Yeah. So yeah, I think we discussed this many times, and basically you were trying to change that degenerate or degeneracy by adding a little dash between degeneracy. But I think it will be very hard to kind of clarify that issue on a wider scale. I mean, they always sort of, somebody sees another person that maybe not perfect and say, oh, this guy is a degenerate. And it doesn't make sense really from the kind of a perspective that we were discussing, that it's so fixed and imprinted in human language and expressions that I would find it almost impossible to replace it with another term and use the term degenerate or degeneracy in a proper context.
Yeah, it's hard because there's no other word for degeneracy, is there?
No, there isn't. Yeah, I mean that's also in a medical science. They use it also in a bit different context that us kind of proper scientists are looking at that. So yes.
I mean, I'm very interested in looking at the history of the word normal, and I think the history of the word degeneracy is equally interesting because the idea that to degenerate is a bad thing is very much a 21st century invention, because the idea of deviating from the normal as being a bad thing to do arose within productivist, industrialized societies where people valued your conformity, they valued your productivity, they valued your contribution to society, what you do. And if you weren't contributing to society, if you weren't conforming to that standard, then that was seen to be a bad thing. And on the flip side, normality was venerated and you had to become the normal, whereas we've completely misunderstood normality and we've completely misunderstood degeneracy. We've focused on a very singular idea of degeneracy, which is flawed. And we have really popularized an incredibly flawed understanding of normality that doesn't help us understand evolutionary characteristics at all. It doesn't help us understand evolutionary systems, but degeneracy, when understood correctly, does. And like you said, it's really important to distinguish between redundancy, which is like choosing between two HB pencils. Which HB pencil am I going to use? Well, that's redundant because either one will do the same task. But if you choose between a pencil and a pen, then...
Or a typewriter, you will still get the same text written. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I totally agree with you. That is actually, and this is actually an interesting point that you are kind of bringing up. I think the majority of people, they don't care about evolution. They think it's for some scientists sort of sitting somewhere in the room and looking at some old fossils and things like that. And I don't think they appreciate sufficiently that they actually seeing evolution around them and they are impacted by that. I mean, the virus is a good example. I mean, this is evolution in action. And there are other things. I mean, I just read an article that humans are developing a new artery in their arms. And there are some other things that are happening. And our brain, I mean, you have to understand that, and people should understand, our brain is evolving all the time. But the brain is only the beginning, probably, of some sort of a future human phenotypes. And we're changing anatomically as well. And we are doing that because of certain medical improvements and developments. And if you take example of females, I mean, many children are not born naturally these days. They are born by cesarean section. And that has actually huge impact on human body, because in the past, women who could not bear children normally, they normally died. So because they had narrow reproductive system and they couldn't simply give birth. Now, obviously, we are changing that because females are prevented by a surgical procedure. So there's already an increase in the kind of changes. So this is just one example how technology changing our bodies and evolution in action. This is evolution in action. We are changing by environmental, in this case, technological advances. We are changing our physiology in our bodies. And there's more example like that. So I think appreciating that on a larger scale would be helpful, I think.
And some of those changes are predictable. Some of those changes are unpredictable. I think we've still yet to understand the impact of the changes that we're seeing in the human microbiome as more and more cesareans are being performed as opposed to natural birth. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've spoken about how the cultural sense of normality that we've established over the last half a century or so has been disrupted because of COVID and climate change as well. We've discussed how normality is not necessarily a useful term for understanding evolutionary processes. And we've also discussed this very technical term of degeneracy and its value for understanding evolutionary processes. Where do we go from here? What questions should we be asking about normality, or what should we be asking perhaps about degeneracy?
Well, I guess you kind of mentioned that problem just a while ago about environment and how environmental changes impact our life and in our interactions. Some time ago when we met, we actually had crickets for lunch. And one reason for that for me was just to see if I can eat crickets. And you were making a point that, and I think it's a very valid, important point, that insects could be an extremely useful any type of nutrition in future that will reduce the impact of CO2 produced by farm animals on our environment. And this is probably an extremely important point that has to be addressed. I like the crickets, I must say. There was no problem. They were kind of tasteless, but they were not repulsive. And because they were hidden in your nice pizza, then of course that was not a problem. So I think that care for environment and our attitude at the moment has to change. Obviously, the focus is on fossil fuels, and that probably can be addressed in one way or another. There will be more sort of a renewable energy sources, but that's not enough. I mean, first of all, we have an enormous population that is just kind of reaching the level that the planet cannot sustain, and we have to think about it. I mean, some sort of a cultural normal again, that having one or two children is probably enough, or maybe in 100 years it will be still too much. So that's one thing, but also people's attitude to life. I mean, the main driver for many people that I know is basically getting a nice car, a bigger house. So very, very materialistic attitude. I don't know many people who think globally and ask themselves a question: is this what I'm doing actually good for the environment? Is it bad, or maybe it's neutral? And in many cases, I'm obviously much older now, and my wife is also older. So we could reduce our imprint on environment significantly. Maybe it's easier for us, but for young people, I guess it's difficult. So this is one of the issues I think it should be kind of addressed. Environment per se, and many young people actually perfectly understand that. I can see students that I knew who are ready to do something, although I'm not entirely sure if they know what to do and how to do it. Basically, quite often it's the expectation, well, the government should do something, but the government is only doing whatever is useful for people and what makes them happy. They will not do something that will sort of prevent them from getting re-elected. So these are kind of loose ideas that I think maybe for the future thinking and our conversation that I'm sure we have plenty.
Professor Ryszard Maleszka, thank you so much for your time and for chatting with us about normality, about degeneracy, and about evolutionary systems. It's been wonderful having you.
Pleasure.